Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Power Hour. This is part 2 on goals and progress monitoring, and today we'll be discussing progress monitoring with Julie Gardner, an education specialist from Kennedy Krieger, who was with us last week. The Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance is the only nonprofit organization whose sole focus is serving the community of children anywhere on the epilepsy surgery journey, from the point of drug resistance through surgery, including the transition to adulthood and beyond. We empower our families with research, support services, and impactful programs before, during, and after surgery. We're formerly known as the Brain Recovery Project, and we're in the 12th year of serving this community. And if I can make my slides work, it's one of those days. Power Hour sessions are brought to you by our corporate sponsor, UCB, and we're very grateful for their support. All right, I am going to stop sharing and hand it over to Julie and let her start sharing.
Okay. And same technical difficulties looking for the screen that I want to share. Hang on.
I made you co-host, I believe.
Yeah, hang on just one second. I'm sorry.
No, today seems to be the technical difficulty day. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I'm just trying to pull up
We were ready, folks.
We were actually
ready. And then everything.
So I apologize. There we go. Okay, hang on one second. All right. And now I lost my ability to do anything. Hang on. Okay. I believe we are there.
Your slides. Yes. Great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. So you want me to just go ahead and get started, Audrey?
Yeah, I'm just going to let you jump right into it. I know I didn't do the formal introduction like last time, but will be on the description of the video and on last session. And if you want to say any more about yourself, I'm sure people would love to hear it.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Julie Gardner. I'm an educational specialist, and I just love working with Audrey and the Alliance, helping families understand a little bit more about the IEP process. So today we're going to be talking about goal monitoring, and we're going to kind of touch on some of the stuff we talked about last week with the IEP goals, but then how do we really monitor them once we have those IEP goals written. So for this presentation, again, I just want to kind of go over these things regarding goal monitoring. So when is progress being measured? How is it measured? How well does your child need to perform in order to say that your child has met a goal or an objective, or a benchmark, short-term objective? And then really importantly is, how will you know when your child is making what they call adequate progress in an IEP? I talk a little bit about who is responsible for goal monitoring, and there's a lot of legislation regarding that right now. And then finally, I want to talk about some red flags with goal monitoring that you should be looking out for when you're in an IEP meeting. So when I think about goal monitoring, and Audrey and I talked about this a little bit before the meeting started, is there's kind of 3 steps, 3 parts or components to goal monitoring. It's not just about the data, right? So the first thing is those SMART goals. We talked about them last week, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have goals that are measurable. Because if they're not measurable, none of the progress monitoring that you're going to be reviewing with your team is going to make any sense at all. The data collection should come from multiple sources. So a lot of times IEPs that I sit in with, they just kind of report one thing, right? So they report on the Woodcock-Johnson, your child scored this score the last time we, assessed your child. But that's not really giving a full picture of what your child is capable of doing. And so when I think about goal monitoring, I think about the whole picture. So things like data logs, work samples is considered data. Objective observations, and I can talk more specifically about what is objective and how do we sort of quantify that. And then, of course, the formal assessments, which are important, the curriculum-based assessments, standardized testing, all of that is important. And then the big piece that I think a lot of times that schools sort of leave out is their analysis and interpretation of the data and explaining that to you. So if you sat down at a table and you got sort of a list of scores from the Woodcock-Johnson, or a list of scores from the iReady assessments, or whatever assessments your school is doing to monitor progress, without really a good analysis and interpretation of that data, it's not meaningful. And then if it's not meaningful to you, then you're not a meaningful participant in that meeting. And so those are kinds of things that I want families to think about when they're looking at data with schools, is it's more than just like you're the receipt of the data, that you really want to be participating in the data analysis and interpretation as well. So when does data get reported? IDEA has been clear about this from the beginning, and they have gotten more clear through legislation in the last probably 10 years or so, that data needs to be reported on IEP goals at least quarterly, or at least in line with what the general education report card reporting is. So if your school does quarterly report cards for general education, then you should be getting quarterly report cards on how your student is progressing with data on each of their IEP goals. And this is important to remember, because I've been through lots of IEP meetings where families get a checkbox that say that their child's making adequate progress, or they get to the end of an IEP year and they find out that their child didn't make progress on a goal at all. And that can be jarring, right? And your child's missed out on a year or more of schooling because you didn't know that they weren't making adequate progress. That is the minimum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. There's a case that I want to talk about towards the end, that's the minimum of how much they have to report it. But if your child requires more reporting than each quarter, if the trimester, or whenever the regular report cards go out, then you can ask for that. And we certainly can talk about some scenarios about where that might be appropriate. So kind of going back to last week, if you were in last week's, we talked a lot about how to write these measurable goals. And I always say, if you write a really good present level of performance and you have a really nice measurable goal, data collection's really easy. It should be anyway, right? So if we look at the goal, we talked about this goal in particular last week. Little Jen is going to get the list of 40 pre-K Dolch sight words in 18-point font. She's supposed to read all 40 words out aloud with no more than 2 errors across 4 trials as measured by the teacher data logs. So this should be a really easy data review for you, because when you look at the data sheets, you should see 3 things. You should see the Dolch sight word list that you can Google online and find the pre-K Dolch sight words, the dates that the teacher took the data. So those are those little 1-minute probes or 5-minute probes or whatever, where the teacher's actually taking data on how well Jenna can read these words, and how many she got correct. And that should be a very easy thing for the teacher just to grab off her desk and bring to an IEP meeting and say, look, we've looked at this over 4 trials in the last, 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever. And this is how Jen is doing on the goal. And you can see if she's moving forward, or if she's sort of stagnated, or if she's doing worse this week than she was last week. So it's important for these goals to be good so that this data is good. What you should not see, and these were taken more or less out of some recent IEPs that I've been in, when we're reporting on data progress, or we come to a meeting for data progress, and the teachers just want to swoon over your child and tell you that she's such a pleasure, that they love her, that she's fun. All of those things are nice to hear, and we want to hear those during parent-teacher conferences. That is not data, though. It isn't data to say that she tries really hard or she never gives up. That is not data. Those are all really great attributes about your child. You likely know them already, but the thing that we want to look at in data is a sort of hard, cold facts. The other thing that we don't really want to see in data collection is these 2 things, behavior and attendance, and how they impact her progress. That is important information, but I wouldn't say often, but many times I've heard schools sort of report that, your child's behavior is what's impacting them. That's why they haven't made progress on their academic goals. Or your child's attendance, because they're out for so many medical appointments. That's why we haven't done anything about their goals. Those are 2 areas that's a huge red flag for me when I hear that, when schools are reporting that that's the reason your child hasn't made progress. If those 2 things are impacting your child's progress on IEP goals, then you should have already had a meeting to discuss that, possibly put in an FBA. If attendance is an issue, specifically if attendance is an issue related to your child's medical needs, then your school should definitely be looking at short-term home and hospital services or intermittent home and hospital services, because just because your child is absent a lot does not absolve the school of making sure that your child's making adequate progress on those IEP goals. And that's an important thing for families to remember. Informal observations are not data. They are helpful and they are a piece of the puzzle, but that is not clear data if it's not formalized data collection. And finally, these blank data logs where I ask teachers to bring in their data logs so that we can look at them, and half the quarter is empty, and then the last 2 weeks before the quarters, the data review comes up, they've got all these little probes that they've taken data on. That is not appropriate data collection. My favorite thing in the world is charts and graphs, because charts and graphs are things that we can look back on. We can plot the data along the way. We can look back and we can see a nice trajectory of progress, either an upward trajectory if we're trying to gain skills, or a downward trajectory if we're working on things like eliminating behaviors or things that are impacting your child's ability to access the curriculum. So if they're not offering you charts and graphs, we're going to talk about this on the next slide, but if they're not offering them to you, I encourage parents to start tracking things on charts and graphs so that you can bring that to the IEP meetings. But I ask schools often can you guys just chart this before we get to the meeting? Because the last time we met was 9 weeks ago, and now you're going to give us more data. I'd like to see those data points along the way. And I always tell families, charts and graphs don't have to be overwhelming or scary. I would just start with a very simple graph sheet and mark where your child is today on a goal, and say 12 weeks from now, which is 3 months, or if you want to do it quarterly, where you want your child to be, right? And then you just draw a line. And then each time you collect the data, you should be seeing some sort of alignment with that goal line, right? Like you want to see those data points sort of hitting it. You're not always going to be right on the line. Sometimes you're going to be a little above, sometimes a little below, but you want to see that general consistency with moving along that goal line, so that that in 12 weeks, you really are making adequate progress to get to that point. And then when you have these graphs, one thing that's interesting is you could say, if this is what your child's graph looks like on a particular goal, you don't really need to do anything. The students doing what they're supposed to be doing, the teachers doing what they're supposed to be doing. We're doing, this is adequate progress. This is what we would expect. If your child's graph starts to look like this, though, that's when you want to kind of sit down with the IEP team and say, this goal that we set is really not that ambitious. It's really not that hard. He is consistently above that line, consistently not even touching the line. So we know that he's well above where we thought he should be. And then conversely, if your child's never touching the line, right, they're never on that trajectory, they're moving in the right direction. And this is where I hear schools say a lot, they've made so much progress, right? But they're still not on this line that we mapped out for them. So are they making adequate progress to hit that goal at the end of the marking period or at the end of the IEP year? And this is the one that I want to really highlight, because a lot of times schools will say, well, it's not quite there, but they still mark he's making adequate progress on his IEP goal. These two lines are parallel. They're never going to cross. So we really need to make sure that we're looking at this data over time, and not just each time you show up, you look at today's data and say, yes, he's better than he was the last time, because that's still not going to meet that goal. Audrey's favorite quote of the year is, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. I hear her say this all the time, and I couldn't agree more. Data should be objective. It's not what the teacher remembers at the IEP meeting. It's not what we thought happened last week. It's not, oh, remember the time that this happened. It is objective, and it should be written down, and you have every right to review it. And if you can't review it, then that's a FERPA issue, and we need to be addressing that administratively, that you need to see those data logs if you have questions about your child's progress. And this is an interesting thing. I have a lot of times I go to school meetings and I'm finding that one-to-one or paraprofessionals or sometimes nurses are the ones taking the data, and there's never any intervention on the professionals, on the IEP team's part to oversee that data. So while paraprofessionals and one-to-ones can sort of chart progress on IEP goals, they are not the people that should be interpreting the data. They are not the ones that should be presenting the data at meetings, which I have seen. It is up to these folks, and the law is very clear that not only is the special educator the one who is required to collect data on IEP goals and report it out. Obviously, related service providers are required to do that for their goals. But the general educator is a big piece of that pie too, because, right, like we talked about last week, the progress in the general ed setting is a huge part of this IEP. And so if you don't have a general educator, if your child is accessing general education and you don't have that general educator providing you with data from the classroom, then you're missing part of the data. The same thing goes for those sort of district-wide, statewide testing. You should have that data sitting at the table as well, so that you're looking at all parts of your child. If your child's not accessing general education at all, then that person obviously wouldn't be there. But all of these people are the ones who are responsible for collecting data, and it should be identified in your IEP somewhere who is collecting the data, so that when you ask for the data, we know who to go to and who's ultimately responsible for it. So what are some red flags in data collection? I'm going to probably hammer this home any single time that Audrey offers to let me come talk to you guys. The lack of clarity and goals is the biggest problem when it comes to monitoring progress in school. If your goals aren't measurable, we can't measure the data, right? We can't measure the progress. So that's an important one to always keep in your mind is, are these goals measurable? The second part of this is, again, if you have the general ed teacher, or rather the special ed teacher, marking the progress on the goal, but then sometimes she lets the one-to-one do it. We got to make sure that one-to-one is qualified to do so, right? We have to make sure that that general ed teacher has not only trained her on what exactly she's marking on the data collection sheets, but then also that she is monitoring that and overseeing that and interpreting that data for you at the meetings, or he. A lot of times I'm hearing this one lately, especially since the pandemic, that schools don't have time or they don't have the resources to take the data. So when I ask for lots of data collection over a quarter, they'll say, well, that's not doable because we don't have the staffing in order to collect that much data that often. But I always go back to rule number one. If the goals are well written and the interventions are happening or the instruction is happening, then data collection should not be difficult. It should actually be part of the whole package. This one is my favorite one. Oops, I'm so sorry. How do I go back? I don't know how to go back. Ooh, there we go. Okay. I'm sorry about that. So this is the other one that happens a lot, where I have really good special ed teachers, really well-meaning folks, but they really don't know how to take the data. So I've actually helped families create data collection sheets for them and said, look, here's the goal, here's the criteria, here's what we want you to mark down, and this is what we want to see at every IEP meeting is the data. You could always ask for your special ed director from your district to come out and train that teacher if you're feeling that the classroom teacher or related service provider just really doesn't have the skill set. I would definitely have somebody from the district level involved saying, you know what, this person needs to learn how to collect data. And then finally, the poor analysis of data. One of my least favorite things to see in an IEP is where they just take your assessment data and they dump it into the present levels and they dump it into the progress monitoring. If they're doing that, then it tells me one of two things. Either they don't really understand the data, they don't understand those assessments well enough to summarize them for you in those areas, and or they don't want to take the time. And if they're not taking the time to do that, then they're really not analyzing your child from all of the different data sources. So that's really important for you to not just accept that this is the data that they're sharing, but for you to get their analysis of that data. So does that mean, so if you have a Woodcock-Johnson score that says your child's reading on a first grade level, but then you have some, second grade reading materials that make it look like your child might be decoding a little bit higher, but not comprehending quite as high. You want somebody to be able to really look at that data and say, this is the whole picture of how your child's reading is, or how your child's math or writing is. And that's important for you to get the classroom teacher to be able to do that. And if that person's not able to do it, your district special ed person, somebody in that IEP team should be able to help you interpret that data. So I looked around, I was looking through a bunch of case law getting ready for this presentation. And these are kind of the areas that came up as the biggest areas of concern when it comes to goal monitoring. The lack of plans for progress. So for progress monitoring, so this is a case that the courts found that simple check marks indicating whether your child is making progress, not making progress is not enough. That is not considered goal monitoring. So if that's all you're getting from your IEP report cards or your progress updates, you need to ask your team for more than that, because they should be supplying you more than just a check mark saying making adequate progress. This is the court case that really talks about that responsibility for progress monitoring, that paraprofessionals can assist, but it's really the IEP team decision whether or not that child's making adequate progress. Behavior intervention plans, we didn't talk too much about this in this presentation, but they really need to be based on assessment data as well. The FBA is usually the assessment that sort of helps the foundation of that BIP. They have to be individualized. They have to include positive behavioral support strategies, which I don't see all the time on behavior intervention plans. And they have to be implemented as planned. And how do we know that? If they have the data to say, this is when this intervention was given, this was your child's response to that intervention, that's all data. And that's all data that you should have access to. This is the case that I talked about earlier, this frequency of reporting progress. So the law says that they have to provide that progress to you at the same rate that they provide general education report cards, right? Or progress in the general education setting. That, however, is, like I said, the minimum. So if your child requires more frequent assessment, then this is sort of the case that laid the groundwork for that, in some situations, it makes sense for kids to have more frequent data monitoring, more frequent data collection, and you as the family can definitely ask for that. And if they refuse it, remember, if they refuse it, they have to tell you why they're refusing it. This particular case had to do with a student with a degenerative disease, and so the need for increased monitoring was more important for him because they were trying to track his medical state. So something to keep in mind for your kids as well. And then finally, these are two interesting cases here where they talk about the progress towards graduation. So if anybody has older kids, in order to graduate a student with a disability under IDA, they have to meet those graduation requirements, right? But they also have to achieve sufficient progress on IEP goals and objectives. And so this is an important one if your student's 19, 20, and that 20-year-old range, and they're talking about sort of exiting them from school, but your child's still not making progress on those IEP goals. We want to really monitor that closely because these two cases support the fact that they don't need to exit if they're not making progress on those goals. So that's something to think about. So together, when I look at all of these, the sort of takeaway is that the courts are indicating that you cannot determine the appropriateness of your program if you don't have proof, right? That's what all of these cases are saying. And what does the court consider proof is the data. So if you're having questions about your child's progress in the general ed curriculum or in the IEP goals, but they're not supplying you with actual data, then they can't really say that placement's appropriate, right? So that's really the kind of the back and forth that I have with schools a lot is saying, well, I'm not sure how we can really say that this is the appropriate placement for this child because we don't feel that he's making progress. You're saying that he's making progress, but you don't have the proof. And really proof is the data collection piece. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I saw there were some questions popping up in the chat.
I was putting some comments in there. So,
oh, okay.
But I have thoughts and questions. And then if anyone else wants to put questions in the chat, and then we'll stop in maybe 10, 15 minutes and the recording, and I'll open it up just for some more informal questions. Mm-hmm. So I have maybe a thought. I don't know if it's a question or a thought. So I want to just talk a little bit about that issue of your child is not making progress on goals because of their behavior. So if you hear that in an IEP meeting, which I know you have heard, and I know I have heard many times, what do you recommend that the parent does if they hear that from the IEP team?
Well, I would want to see the data, right? So is it that your child is having behavioral problems in the morning? And so that's when we do our reading. And since your child was having behavior in the morning, they didn't get their reading intervention. We didn't take the data collection during reading because your child was having a behavior problem, right? Mm-hmm. If that is the case, then they need to respond to that behavior in a way where we maybe do reading in the afternoon on that day, mm-hmm. or we do data collection in a different way, because they can't use your child's behavior as a reason not to monitor progress or not to implement the IEP. If
Yeah.
it's a persistent issue, then I would recommend, let's look at, is there a FBA or a BIP in place? And if so, then are they adequate? Are they based on data? And are they implementing them with fidelity? Because if they are not rather, then that's sort of the problem, right?
Yeah. What I often see is that when you really get down to it, if the child has a BIP, has had a good FBA and has a BIP, oftentimes when there's a behavior issue, it's because the staff is not implementing the BIP with fidelity 99% of the time. So if your child has a behavior intervention plan and there's a problem, it's probably because someone on the team or all the team is not implementing that BIP with fidelity. So getting the data can kind of help hold the staff, their feet to the fire. The other thing is what I hear often, and I heard this with my own son, is your child's behavior is preventing his access to making progress on his goals, which is ultimately preventing access to curriculum, preventing access to FAPE, right? So then I said, okay, I want a functional behavior assessment. Well, that's only for kids who are like throwing furniture across the room, putting a knife to their teacher's throat. I literally heard this from my son's IEP team. I live in San Francisco, but I mean, people do not hold their knives to teachers' throats very often, I don't think. But anyway, so I said, well, but you just told me that my son's behavior was impeding his access to curriculum. And the way I read the law is if the child's behavior impedes their own or someone else's access to curriculum, they're entitled to an FBA. So if you get pushback, just push back again and get that FBA. Your child might not have a behavior problem. There might be a staff problem, but sometimes asking for that FBA and going through that process, again, it just illustrates where the gaps are in support for that child throughout the day. Like what you said first about time of day is huge for our kids. So if the child has had a big surgery, they might be really tired by the end of the day. So if you're trying to do academic instruction with a kid after lunch who's had a hemispherectomy, probably not going to get a lot out of that kid.
Right.
Conversely, if the child has seizures in the morning and they go to school and they're sort of out of it and they've had a seizure and they're maybe just had their medication, they're probably not really functional in the morning. So you should also be working with your IEP team to optimize instruction at the right time of day for your child to help prevent behaviors. And every time your team says that your child's behavior is impeding their access to making progress on the goals, it's an opportunity for you to then like say, let's lift up the curtain and find out what's going on here. Let's change this. Let's change that, right? Use it as a tool rather than frustrating, being frustrated by it. One parent says all regular ed time is always the last thing in the day. So that's a problem. If it's working for your kid, that's great, right? I'm not going to say it's always a problem, but that's concerning. So that might be a conversation for the IEP team. If it's working, no problem. But if he's not able to access or benefit from it, you're saying that does not work. That's what the parent responded. So I know it's choose your battles. That's the other thing. And I know that's particular parent, and there's a lot of battles, right, for all of us. So maybe fighting for moving gen ed time is not at the top of your list because you're focused on other priorities. But at some point, he is required to be included in the gen ed curriculum and in the gen ed classroom required by law. And if they're not facilitating that to make it work for him, then he's not actually accessing FAPE, right? So it's just kind of going back to remembering what the law says. It's kind of have to memorize it. Monica in her presentations always says, here's the IDEA, read it, and gets these eye rolls. And over the years I have read parts of it so many times now, I feel like I've read the whole thing, but it's all in there. Everything that we need to know on what to do is in there. I want to talk a little bit more about if it's not in writing, it didn't happen, and how that relates to having the team document how they are going to document progress on your child's goals. And that might be different for a different provider, but like, how do you write that into the IEP? Let's say the PT says, I'm going to do this, and the literacy teacher says, I'm going to do that. So where do you like putting that in the IEP? Because them saying in the IEP meeting, remember, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So if they say in the IEP meeting, I'm doing X, then you're saying, okay, let's put that right in the IEP. But where do you like to see that live? Do you like it as part of the goal, or do you like it elsewhere?
I like to see it directly in the goal. Like I want to see, so I went back to this screen here, right there, as measured by teacher data logs, so that when I do my quarterly data meetings with this school, I say, I want to see those quarterly teacher data logs. I want to see those data logs. And that teacher should be able to just grab them off the shelf and bring them in. It shouldn't be something that she has to do extra work for, because all during the quarter, she should be taking data on Jenna's goal here, on this goal that Jenna's working on every time she works with her, or every time she, looks at this skill. So I want to see it directly in the goal. And I also want to see it marked who is going to do it. Is it the general ed teacher? Is it the special ed teacher? Is it the related service provider? That should all be listed right there clearly for you to see. I have seen, I feel like it's West Virginia, but I have seen where they put all of that information in the prior written notice, which is quite cumbersome, but it's there. I mean, the information is there. So as long as you know where it is in your IEP, I don't know where everybody's from, but most of the time I see it close to where the goal is, or where the goal is.
I also, so some of our kids require more frequent progress monitoring. Like they might really need a progress meeting every 4 to 6 weeks, right? Like 8 weeks might really be too long. And so you have a right as a parent to ask for that, and get, if you get the team support with that, you're part of the IEP team, you're part of making that request and getting that if you need it. And also look at the program they're using for your child. So if they're using an evidence-based literacy curriculum with Fidelity, my guess is they have to collect data twice a week, right? And then they maybe have like a summary report every 2 weeks, right? If you look at most literacy programs, it's pretty, maybe it's even every day. So I would want that in the goal as well. Like if it's a goal that's aligned with a multisensory literacy instruction, a particular curriculum, which I know schools don't like to list the actual curriculum, but you can describe the curriculum and say, based on the curriculum that's being used for the student, with daily data collection and progress reported every 4 weeks, something like that. So it's very, very clear, because if it wasn't in writing, it didn't happen. And then sometimes I have parents that still have to send reminders to the team, like, hey, next week is our 4-week meeting. Like nobody's called a meeting. Some parents will calendar them out at the beginning of the year. So first meeting, they'll say, we need to meet every 4 weeks. Let's just get those all on the calendar. How about Friday mornings from 8 to 8:30? Great. And then everybody puts it on their calendar and they're good for the year. So
yeah. And I think just to piggyback on that, I think it's important too, especially for kids with hemispherectomy, is that they need to be closely monitored. I put that in the present levels underneath medical, that they need to be closely monitored in all these different areas, so that then you have the justification to ask for those meetings, right? So especially somebody who's just recently had a surgery and is sort of in that recovery period. I always get that into the medical present level of performance, so that we can explain why do they need to be monitored so closely. So that when we get to the point where we're talking about progress monitoring, I can say, remember that part back there where we said that they need to be closely monitored? This is what we're talking about. We want to meet with you every 4.5 weeks, every 6 weeks, whatever seems appropriate.
Yeah, remember everyone, this is why your present levels have to be so good. It's the foundation. It's the foundation of your house, and what builds your foundation is all those assessments.
Yep.
But I would say more than just hemispherectomy. I think all kids with epilepsy and epilepsy surgery are vulnerable to fluctuations in learning and fatigue and possible setbacks. I had a student I was helping last year who had just a laser ablation, right? Which sounds so mild after you've cut out half your child's brain, but he was 6 months out, couldn't concentrate, had constant headaches, had visual disturbances, like had some ocular motor issues and visual processing, had to have home instruction. It was quite a long recovery for him. I think he's doing a little bit better now, but I don't think it matters. The surgery matters as much as how your child is presenting and what their needs are. Definitely using that as a basis for the team to understand. But if you look at a lot of the literature out there, there's very little research on post-epilepsy surgery and learning. There's a lot on epilepsy and learning, and the impacts of just epilepsy on kids in the school setting are quite significant. So just being aware of that you can advocate for that. And I love having that in the present levels and just really documenting that. Let's talk a little bit more about the para's role, because I see this all the time. And I had a case last year. I was helping this family in San Francisco, a high school boy who was nonverbal, and long story. He was receiving his literacy instruction in a separate room from the classroom, down the hall from the classroom teacher, by a para. So what would you say to that?
Well, and this I wouldn't say it depends on district, but I see it done differently, lots of different ways. The teacher of record is the one who oversees the instruction. Can a para do, daily reading with the student in an intervention? Yes, but they cannot introduce a skill and they cannot interpret the data. So what they can do is if the teacher introduces a new skill or a new section of the intervention, then that para can sit with them. They can take data, they can, take running records, they can do all of that kind of stuff. And then they turn it over to the general ed or special ed teacher. And that person is the one who has to oversee that instruction. I always say in these situations, you've got to be pretty trusting if you're going to turn over your responsibility to your para, because ultimately that teacher is the one who is responsible for the progress that your child makes. And so I have had same situation where I'm sitting in a meeting and they bring the para in to explain what the child is able to read. And I said, I'm sorry, it's nice that you know this child, but you're not part of this IEP team. That is not the para's role.
Yeah.
It is not.
Yeah. And I see it the opposite, where oftentimes parents want paras to come into IEP meetings, but you can see why it's better not to do that, because you don't want the para to be your child's educator. A para is not a special educator. A para is not trained. The qualifications for a para in most states is a high school diploma and no criminal record, and that's it.
Yeah.
So a special educator is someone who has an advanced degree usually, and has training in working with kids with special needs and has taught specific curriculums. In this particular case that I just mentioned, the child was nonverbal and used an AAC device, and the classroom teacher, the special ed teacher, was new and didn't know how to use the AAC device. So not only was she not implementing the curriculum, she couldn't even communicate with the student. And the school district thought that was perfectly fine. But anyway, that's another story.
Wow.
So I would just be really, really careful about paras. They should not be instructing your child. And so what we ended up saying was, how are you overseeing this para? How are you monitoring the, she also the teacher didn't know the curriculum the student was using. So we insisted on some teacher training. We got the teacher trained on the intervention because she was new and the intervention had been used for a couple of years. He was a child with very severe learning disability as well, and was, using a very specific curriculum that the district didn't use. So anyway, we got the training and they basically moved him so he would be in the room adjacent to the classroom so that she could answer questions that the para had. But it was basically they would have class and he and the para would go in the other room. And I think that is really a big red flag. If you're doing that with a special educator or a resource teacher and you're getting direct instruction, or there's a tutor that is skilled in a specific subject area or something like that, that's different. But having a para take your child out of education to educate you. And then when we get back to progress monitoring, unless the progress monitoring says the para is doing the data collection, but even if it does, you have to really question, why is the para doing this? Are they qualified to do it? Have they had training to do it? All of that. You don't want confusion about the roles.
Yeah. And if that's the situation, then remember that part of the IEP can include teacher training on the AAC device, for example, in this situation. Or you can put in there that the teacher gets, that there's regular ongoing in-service training for teachers on specific things, right? So it could be on that reading intervention, it could be on the AAC device, it could be on any of that, if that's an area of concern for your IEP.
And parents are also entitled to training under IDEA. I don't know if you know that. It's called Parent Counseling and Training. I know you know that, Julie. I'm all of you out there. So if you don't understand how to look at your child's data or how to understand what curriculum they're on, I had a family whose child had an AAC device and the family didn't know how to use it. You have to know how to communicate with your own child. So the school is required to provide parent training to teach you how to use the AAC device. For example, if your child had specific bracing or seating at school and you didn't know how to replicate that at home or use it at home, the PT would have to come to your house and teach you, this is how we do it. If there was a special feeding, whatever it is, anything that is happening, and you can ask for specific training. It could be done by the related service provider, or it might be, someone that the district hires. My last question, and then we can pause and open it up to others. I don't see anything in the chat. Is what happens when schools just don't do this well? So often I see, I want data. Well, too bad, we have no data. So then the parent is like, well, I'm not going to sue the school over the fact that they're not providing progress reports, and maybe my kid's doing okay, and I don't really know what to do, or that the progress is written so poorly that it's meaningless. Andy's such a hard worker. He's trying really hard. When the goal is written that he'll do X 5 times at 80% accuracy, and the progress report doesn't even address the accuracy or the frequency of progress. So what do parents do when the district is just like, yeah, no. I mean, I know there's case law. I know that legal routes are an option, but just for the average parent who's like, I don't know what to do in this situation.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's like you said earlier, you want to prioritize what you're sort of in battle with the school. I always say 2 things. One, if you have questions about whether or not your child is making progress, and I sit with lots of families who say, they keep saying that he's making adequate progress, but I don't see it at home. I don't see that here. I always say this might be the hill that I would die on, because this is one of the most important things that says whether or not your child is actually kind of closing that gap, right, between where they started and where you want them to be. It doesn't matter how good the IEP, how well the IEP is written. It doesn't matter how well the IEP goals are written. If your child's not making progress, they're not making progress for some reason. And we need to get the data to find out why. And like you said, sometimes it sort of pulls the curtain back on, is it a teacher issue? Is it a training issue? Or is it your child? The goal isn't written well for your child, too high or too low for your child. So I've been accused by attorneys of picking the wrong hill sometimes to die on, but this is the one that I always say this should be second nature to any special ed or related service provider in your school, is to take data, because we can't make decisions on how they did this year's IEP goals without good data, and we can't make good present levels of performance on next year's IEP if we don't have good data from this year. So I really feel like it's just lip service if we don't have good data, to be perfectly honest. So this would be the hill that I would die. This would be my priority, to say, I'd like to see the data. Could we meet, at the end of the quarter? I just want you to show me what data you have, no judgment. I just want to see the data. And I want to see work samples. I want to see the standardized test results. I want to see all that. And I want somebody from your district to be able to explain to me where my child functions.
Yeah. At the end of the day, remember last session, we talked about a goal. You should be able to understand what will my child be doing when this goal is met? And so progress reporting is how close is my child to getting to their goal. It shouldn't be that complicated, right? But sometimes it is. Another thing I find is a lot of parents don't look at those quarterly progress reports. So one thing to do, it's a little bit time consuming, but if your child is not making progress, I like spreadsheets. I know you like graphs and charts, but I'm a spreadsheet person. So what I do is I plot, here's the goal, here's the baseline, here's the goal, progress 1, progress 2, progress 3, and then end. And when I get to the end, sometimes we're at progress 3 and the goal is like 10% met. So then it's like a conversation with the team, or even progress report 2. And we're saying, look, this kid's made 5 or 10% progress on a goal that he's supposed to be at 80%. What are we changing? Are we going to change the intensity of the instruction, the frequency, the type of instruction, the setting, who's providing it, the time of day? Like, what needs to change because this kid is not making, or is it just a crappy goal? Like sometimes goals are just not well written, which I get. Another strategy that I like to share is to teach the teacher how to write progress reports. And this can be a little tricky because you don't want to step on toes. If it's a senior teacher, an older teacher, you're probably not going to get any traction on this. So maybe don't even try. But for younger teachers, or maybe teachers that are new to, I often will couch it in, you have never worked with a child like mine because my child had half of his brain removed, and they've never worked with a child who'd had epilepsy surgery before, right? So you're not like making them feel bad. But for example, the kid last year with a new teacher where she wrote the progress, which was Andy's working so hard on his goal. We just kept sending the progress reports back marked up. Like, what does this mean? Please tie it to the data. And after the second one, she called in tears, the parent. It was like, I don't know what to do. And so the parent messaged me and she's like, what should we do? And I said, let's teach her. And she's like, really? We can do that? So I reached out to her and I said, would you like to learn how to write progress reports? And she said, yes, please. And then for the next couple ones, we wrote them together and they were really good, because what we wanted was for her to look at the goal, the way the goal was written. And then, so we're here and we want to get here. And then how are you measuring it? So it can't just be I could be standing still and still trying really hard to run my marathon, right? Like in my head, I'm really thinking about it. I'm preparing myself mentally. I'm working really hard, but I haven't gotten anywhere. So we have to actually measure the progress, not just the motivation or intent. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I know this can be very frustrating for a lot of parents because schools tend to act like the experts in this area. And parents tend to agree that they're the experts and they're confused by even how the goal is written, which you shouldn't be. So that's step one. If you don't understand your goal, have them rewrite it or teach you. And then step two is to make sure that they're actually including you in the progress monitoring and, implementing curriculum with fidelity, et cetera. So, yeah. Do you have any other thoughts? And then what I might do is just pause stop the recording and see if anyone else wants to open up.
No, I agree. I know you like the spreadsheets. The reason I like the graphs, though, I think they're easy for families to just sort of get a piece of graph paper and just say, my child can read 3 words. At the end of this year, I want him to read 10. This is where we're at. And each time you get a little bit of data, you can add it to your chart and you can bring that chart in and say, I know you think he's making good progress and he is doing better because now he can read 4 words. However, in another 3 months, we're expecting him to read 10 words. So how do we get there? And it's kind of the same thing that you're describing with the spreadsheet. And then this chart, I really like, it came from Peabody Vanderbilt. I like this because then we can really see over time whether or not your child is above or below or exactly where they should be and what to do about that. And so a lot of times I bring this little chart in and I say to the teachers, you see this? They're making progress, but they're never going to cross that line. So what do we need to do? Yeah,
you're 100% right. And the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates is always doing a session on data collection and graphs. I'm just afraid of graphs because I'm not a math person. So I think it's like a personal block for me, but I think you're absolutely right. And you can see by looking at this, how meaningful it is to see it that way. So